start. So I'm Ruth Herbert, Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, and I'm welcoming all participants to this webinar. I'm delighted to see such high level of interest. It's really great. This is one of our monthly webinar series that we run as the CCSA, alternating between member only and external webinars. So today's is obviously aimed at external stakeholders, and I'm delighted to say we're doing it in partnership with Net Zero Week 22, which is the UK's National Awareness Week, highlighting the climate challenge and the opportunities and benefits that will arise from making the change to net zero. So please do look at the Net Zero Week website, because there's loads of similar events all week and lots of resources on net zero. So it's a really good source of information. Just a bit of housekeeping before we launch into the topic. If you could remain muted with your camera off during presentations, that would be great. The webinar will be recorded, and the slides and recording will be circulated to all participants afterwards and available on the CCSA website. We'll take questions at the end, and I'm hoping we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for those. And you can put written questions in the chat, but you can also, during the Q&A session, of course, put your hand up, put your camera on and ask a question orally. So please do use the Q&A function in the main control panel on the screen for that as well, and I will attempt to ask your question to the panelists. If you are asking a question orally, please ask to do so via the chat, and then I'll introduce you and tell you when to come in. The context for this webinar is that today, it's 6 months since COP26 in Glasgow. In fact, it feels like a bit longer than that. I think it is a little bit longer than that. I was there, it seems a very long time ago, but almost a similar distance really to COP27. We just thought it would be a really good opportunity to kind of reflect on the progress on CCUS, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, both within the UK and elsewhere around the world, and just think about how far we've come since Glasgow, and what we still need to do, and where we're heading for Saudi Arabia. And before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a brief overview of our own work on CCUS in the UK. And we published this in March, and I thought it'd be useful just to set the scene for a couple of minutes. So bear with me while I share my screen. And hopefully this works. Okay. And hopefully that's on full screen now. And hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So this piece of work was called the CCUS Delivery Plan 2035. I'm just going to kick off with a tiny bit about CCUS and the CCSA, as this is an external webinar. I'm not assuming everybody knows what that is, and then talk a little bit about the work. First of all, the CCSA, we're a trade association. Our vision is widespread deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. By CCUS technologies, we mean technologies that capture CO2. That's typically using solvents or other types of capture technology. And that can be from power generation, industrial sites, hydrogen production, or bioenergy sources, and also direct air capture from the atmosphere. That CO2 can be transported by pipeline or ship, but also by rail or road, and stored deep in geological formations, so depleted oil and gas fields or deep saline aquifers. This is under the seabed, is the plan in the UK to do that under the seabed, so offshore. But we also have members looking at using CO2 in products. Sometimes that's will be permanently stored, for example, CO2 heavy aggregates that can be used, or CO2 that can be used in other building materials. So these are different ways of making sure the CO2 doesn't return to the atmosphere, and obviously that's the most important thing for the climate. If context, CCUS is viewed as not just being important technology for the UK, but also globally, with about over 7 billion tonnes of CO2 needing to be captured per year and permanently stored by 2050 from a diverse range of sources, as we've just discussed. This is according to the IEA's roadmap. Yeah, we can talk more about that later on. The CCSA is focused really on Europe. So we have an office in London and an office in Brussels, and we're focused on commercial deployment of CCUS. We want to see large-scale CCUS as soon as possible. And we do that through advocacy, but also collaboration. So bringing the industry together to find our own solutions to make this move along more quickly, but also, of course, advocating with government, civil society for the steps that need to be taken. And we're really unique because we do actually represent the entire CCUS value chain. So people, end users of the technology, all through all the different parts, capture, transport and storage, as well as the supporting sectors. So this is a snapshot of our membership. So what we do in the Delivery Plan 2035? Well, we did this project earlier this year. It was really in response to the government's Net Zero strategy, which was published just before COP27 last November. And the ambition there was a pathway to achieve net zero by 2050, which included interim targets, including an ambition to capture 20 to 30 million tonnes a year by 2030 using CCUS, and for that to rise to over 50 million tonnes a year by 2035. This was intended to happen through 4 clusters, which is a collection of emitters with a common sort of pipeline and storage infrastructure, to have 2 of those operating by the mid-20s and another 2 by 2030. And there was an infrastructure fund for some capital costs to go towards all of that. So as an industry, we looked at all the areas in the UK where we had cluster potential. And there's many of these. Some of them have got names next to them, some haven't, because they're still developing as clusters, but they're highlighted on the map there. The government launched a sequencing program in May last year to push forward, because the 4 cluster announcement was also in the 10-point plan, which had been a year earlier than the net zero strategy. So it already started that process. In November last year, they selected the first 2 clusters that would go forward, HyNet and the East Coast Cluster, and the Scottish Cluster as a reserve. Track 2, the further 2 clusters to be operational by 2030, we don't have any details on that yet. So as the industry, we said, well, perhaps we need to actually think about how we might deliver the 50 million tonnes by 2035, because that's quite a challenging interim target and it's not that far off. So we looked at 2 things, kind of what is the ideal build out rate to achieve that 2035 target, and what actions are needed to enable that. And we came up with, we had workshops across the industry and with external stakeholders to understand what was required. And we came up with a framework of building blocks of things that needed to be in place to make sure that we could have a successful industry in the UK that was storing enough to meet the net zero strategy, so our own reductions, but also exploiting global opportunities. For example, we can also help Europe to decarbonise as well, because we have something like between us and Norway, about 85% of Europe's storage potential offshore. What did we find out? We found out that yes, we could meet those levels of deployment. We actually put the capture ambition there, and we said these are the volumes that the government has committed to by 2030. Here's the project pipeline that we've identified across the UK, which is currently at risk because we don't know if the government wants to proceed at that pace. We only have the black volume confirmed, and also that shipped CO2 would be really, really important if we were to make 2035, because not all sites are close to, not all heavy emitters are close to storage sites, and therefore we're going to need shipping of CO2 as well. And it'd be really, really important in the 2030s. Is there enough storage? We thought we'd better look at that as well. And we found that actually, if we did deploy at the pace that we wanted to go at, then yes, we would run out of storage if we only had the 4 licensed sites that we have currently, but actually there's many, many more sites willing to come forward. And we're really delighted that on the back of this work, the North Sea Transition Authority brought forward their licensing round, and that many industry are planning to take part in that, because there is actually a huge swathe of potential storage out there, but it needs to be developed and it does have rather long lead-in times. So we need to get cracking with those sites now as well. So we felt pretty positive that we could do it, but we really recommend having an accelerated build-out rate, because in order to invest in the skills and capacity to do this, we need to have confidence over the pace that we're going to go. Clearly, CCS at the moment is not commercially viable, although many of the technologies are coming down in cost. So we do need the government support framework that is being developed and that the Energy Security Bill is putting in place. But if the government moves forward with regular allocations of contracts, we believe that we can get the domestic supply chain benefits, that we can have clean products made here in the UK. There are export opportunities and opportunities to develop skills and safeguard existing jobs as well, to have enhanced competitive UK manufacturing. So that's it. I will stop there. That's the end of the pitch, and I'll move to introduce our other panelists. So first up, we have Dr. David Joff from the UK's Climate Change Committee. David is the head of carbon budgets at the Climate Change Committee, and he's worked there since 2007. He oversees all the committee's advice on levels of UK carbon budgets and the pathways to meet these and the net zero target. He oversaw the scenario analysis and recommendations for the 2020 advice on the 6th carbon budget with the 5 pathways to net zero for the UK. He oversees the CCC's energy system analysis and has led the hydrogen review in 2018. And he has a PhD on hydrogen infrastructure from Imperial College London. I'm really delighted we've got David, because I think the CCC's work, which was very recently published on the progress in the UK, I think was a real step forward for the CCC, really important for the UK. And as business, we're really keen to know how it's going. And so I'm really delighted that he's here to come and give his view on that. Thank you, David.
That's great, Ruth. Thanks very much. Thanks for your kind words. Yeah, I'm David Joffe. I'm head of carbon budgets at the Climate Change Committee. I'll just share my screen. There we are. I think that's working. All right. So I'm going to start off by setting out the role of CCS in our pathways, the CCC's pathways, in the advice that we've given to the government. I'll then touch on the net zero strategy and the energy security strategy that was published a couple of months ago, before giving you some messages from our annual progress report to UK Parliament that was published last week. Okay, so the CCC is the statutory advisor to the UK government and to devolved governments on climate change. We have recommended the path for emissions out to net zero by 2050, but also in the medium term in a series of carbon budgets. These are 5-year limits on emissions allowed, centred on round numbered years. So the most recent one was the 2020 advice on the 6th carbon budget. That's the purple one there, which was advised by us in December 2020 and legislated by the government at the level recommended in 2021. It was the first carbon budget that was set on the path to net zero, and that's why you see quite a sharp reduction, a sharp rate of reduction in allowed emissions, because of the need to get on track to net zero. So that's some context for where the pathways that I'm going to talk about come from. I'll come on. So this is essentially a visualization of our balanced net zero pathway, as we call it, which was the pathway that underpinned that advice on the level of the budget. So this pathway would exactly meet the path for emissions that we recommended to the government. And this visualization allows us to see the relative contributions of different solutions to reducing emissions over the next 28 years. Along the top, we've got effectively what would happen to emissions if we didn't have any policies. And the purple line that goes down to net zero by 2050 is the path that we need to follow for emissions. So we see that broadly speaking, there's four categories of ways of reducing emissions. One is the demand side in terms of both reduced demand for carbon intensive activities. So that might be flying less, it might be not eating as much red meat, but also improved energy efficiency. So not necessarily doing less, but being more efficient in the way we do it. We need to expand low carbon energy. It was great to see the offshore wind results this morning in terms of expanding low carbon energy and pushing unabated fossil fuels to the fringes of electricity supply. There's some potential for that, but we're going to need other solutions as well. Then there's a huge orange wedge here of electrification. We think this is the backbone really of the transition, pushing out petrol use, for example, petrol and diesel use in transport, pushing out fossil gas use in buildings and industry. And that's the single biggest wedge and a very important part. But again, it can't do everything. So we then think there's a really important role for hydrogen to do the bits that electrification can't feasibly do, as well as CO2 capture from the industrial sector in the blue wedge there. And finally, we've got greenhouse gas removals. Now, this version of the chart is actually unpublished, but this version breaks out the role for CCS in the transition in our pathway. So all the hashed areas are the bits that use CCS in our balanced pathway. So we've got some in low carbon electricity supply in terms of just doing that last bit, maybe the last 15% of electricity generation. So we can do maybe the first 85% with zero carbon sources such as offshore wind, solar, onshore wind, and nuclear. But you get to a point where, both because of the variability of the generation from those sources, and because demand is not flat all the time, it's obviously peaky, it's higher in the winter, higher early evening, and so on. We need sources of on-demand capacity that we can depend upon, but those need to be decarbonised, and CCS is a crucial part of that, whether that's a gas plant with CCS on it, whether it's a hydrogen turbine generating electricity from hydrogen, and some of that hydrogen might be produced with using CCS, and that's the hashed red wedge as well for the hydrogen supply that might be from fossil fuels. And then there's a really important role for greenhouse gas removals, which I will come on to in my next in the slide after next. So this slide is just to explain that we do have 5 pathways to net zero by 2050. The 2 axes that we vary there are the degree of behaviour change across the economy, and you know, do we rely more on technology or more on behaviour? So that's one axis, and the other one is the degree of innovation and particularly cost reduction in things like electricity generation, even, you know, halving costs of renewables from the sorts of levels we see today. And the balanced pathway is intended to steer a kind of middle path through those. So this chart shows across the 4 scenarios that reach net zero in about 2050, we've got one that goes way earlier by 2042, but these are the 4 in 2050 that have just reached net zero. And there's a really important role for carbon capture across all of these scenarios, even the widespread engagement scenario, which is the one with the most behaviour change. But you'll see in that scenario, that's the one that needs the least carbon capture. So there is this trade-off. The more behavioural change that we can have, the reduction in meat and dairy consumption that reduces emissions, but also frees up land for growing trees and those sorts of things, and the more limits on aviation demand we can have, the less we're going to need CCS. But also there are choices here. So you see that, for example, in the headwind scenario, which is less ambitious on behaviour change, the choice there is there's a lot of hydrogen actually in that scenario, and quite a lot of hydrogen in our buildings pathway for that particular scenario, and so that increases the amount of hydrogen that needs to come from fossil fuels with CCS, and therefore the overall amount of CCS. So there's quite a big variation there. Now, we've tried to limit the role of CCS and of greenhouse gas removals in particular as part of our pathway analysis, because this is an awful lot. I mean, across all of these pathways, this is a lot of CCS, you know, going from what is effectively a standing start with a few false starts over the last decade or decade and a half as well. And we don't actually know how much of this we can really do by 2050 in a sustainable way. So we try to minimize that. In our balanced pathway on greenhouse gas removals, we have around 60 megatons a year of CO2 being removed through a combination of technologies. Now, that's less than all of the government's 2050 pathways that has around 80 or a bit more than 80 megatons a year. So they're already going above the level that we've recommended. And that reflects really that the government has been less keen to promote the sorts of things that require less technology reliance. So the demand side actions on aviation demand, on diet, and on a range of other things. So we need more technology solutions. We need more greenhouse gas removals to balance those emissions that will remain in those other sectors. Now, there's a danger that, you know, if the government delivers on its pathway, fine, and 80 megatons a year maybe is okay by 2050, and it's within the range that we've published. But the danger is that we fall short on, let's say, buildings decarbonisation or industrial decarbonisation. And we say, well, that's kind of fine because we can just do more greenhouse gas removals. Actually, we don't think that is fine because there will be a limit. We don't know exactly what the limit is. But, you know, one of the messages that was in our annual progress report to Parliament last week was you can't keep adding to that stack of required greenhouse gas removals. You've actually got to find alternative ways of reducing emissions. Maybe if we're less successful in deploying heat pumps in buildings, then we need to find other ways, maybe more district heating, for example, or a combination of solutions that might include some hydrogen. And then, well, where do we get the hydrogen from and so on? Is that imports? Is that blue hydrogen, etc.? So there are big questions around that, but it shouldn't just be we'll just do more removals. We can always do more removals. So that's a key point from our message, from our report last year. Now, the wedge of CCS that we have in our pathways and the government has in its as well on fossil energy generation. So this will be fossil gas with carbon capture, either for in a power plant or for hydrogen production. That all looked quite sensible in 2020 when we were developing our pathways, and in 2021 when the government was developing its pathway. But, you know, since then the world has changed. Gas is much more expensive than it was 2 years ago, and there are concerns as well about energy security. So the government's energy security strategy, which came out a couple of months ago, was more ambitious on the non-fossil energy generation, and to some extent that can do some things to reduce the reliance on fossil gas, reduce the reliance on CCS in energy generation. If we produce even more from renewables and nuclear, that will fill some of the gaps that otherwise would have been filled by the things I talked about, hydrogen and gas with CCS on the generation side, but there'll also be surpluses. Those surpluses can be used to produce hydrogen from zero carbon sources, and that can be used again instead of producing hydrogen from fossil fuels with CCS. So that increased ambition on non-fossil energy supply does push out some of that required gas with CCS, and we think that's appropriate in the current circumstances. There are, of course, big questions about what will happen to gas prices over the next few years and what the role of gas with CCS is over the rest of this decade and beyond. No one knows what the right answer to that is. The other thing to say is that although I am inferring a lot of these messages from what the government has set out, it hasn't actually spelled out that it is planning to do less fossil CCS and more zero carbon generation. We don't have a system strategy for the 2035 full decarbonisation of electricity supply to which the government has committed. We don't know exactly how they're planning to meet that. So we are relying on the insights that we've got from our analysis rather than actually having a government. Okay, briefly from the report that we published last week, the annual progress report to Parliament. So this is a type of chart that we've done many times before in our progress reports that sets out the risks to delivery of the government's pathway. So again, along the top, we have baseline, what would happen to emissions without policy. Along the bottom, what the government policy is, and then different coloured wedges relating to different levels of assessed risk in delivering those emissions reductions. There's a lot more green than there was a year ago, so that's great. And green and yellow are now more than half of the emissions reductions out to the 6th carbon budget, which is the carbon budget covering the mid-2030s. So that's positive. It's a step forward due to the net zero strategy and the policies that come forward flowing in the process around that strategy. But it's not enough. We will need more. And that's one of the messages in the assessment last week. If we then look target by target, we've got a 4th carbon budget that starts next year for 5 years to 2027. And we think that, so here again, the structure is as before, but now the horizontal purple line is the target. Okay, so on the 4th carbon budget one on the left-hand side, we don't need all of the emissions reduction in the government's pathway actually to meet that carbon budget. We can go as far as about halfway through the yellow chunk, and that will be enough for the carbon budget. And as you go on to our 2030 NDC under the Paris process, you see that actually we start to need almost all of the emissions reductions set out in the government pathway, and there are significant risks over a good chunk of that, and even further for the 6th carbon budget, and then we're into insufficient plans for some of that as well. So that's where we are. It's fair to say as well that in some sectors we're well placed, such as electricity generation and electric cars, and in other sectors the picture is less rosy. So moving on to a sector by sector assessment, again, same structure. The top of the sectoral columns here now is what would happen without policy. The bottom is where do we need to get to. And surface transport and electricity supply, there's lots of green there, and that's pretty positive. But then across buildings, across manufacturing, construction, or industry, as many people call it, and land use and agriculture, as well as engineered removals, those are kind of some of the big sectors that deliver some of the big emissions reductions that we need. There's not a lot of green, and there's quite a lot of orange and red. So we're worried about those. The scorecard on the right-hand side here tries to break this down and say, actually across 5 different criteria, where are we at? What's the assessment on a sector-by-sector basis? And yeah, there's quite a lot of orange, a little bit of red, not too much green. So yeah, transport and electricity, great. And some of the other sectors really not so great. That's not to say, of course, this is all for 2035, is not to say that further policies can't come forward to turn those orange and red wedges green or yellow. So there is still potential, particularly for the targets that are further out, to get things back on track and to be on track to meet those targets. So that's it from me. I will stop sharing now, and happy to answer questions later on.
Thanks, David. I think we'll now move and hear from Nora. So really great to hear where we are in the UK. Nora's going to talk to us about global progress on CCS. She is the Global CCS Institute's Senior International Climate Change Policy Advisor based in London. Having worked closely with governments, businesses, NGOs and multilaterals worldwide, she has served as one of the government of the Kingdom of Bahrain's lead negotiators at the UNFCCC, where she's coordinated for the Group of 77 and China, and has worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund and the Small Island Development States. And she's also been a regional and country liaison for various key strategic partnerships She's also held positions in the Climate Change and Sustainability Services Department at Ernst & Young, Middle East Head Office, and in the Climate and Energy Department at Greenpeace's EU unit. She has an undergraduate degree in ecological science, conservation and ecological management from the University of Edinburgh, and a master's in managing environmental change from the University of St Andrews. So very well qualified, Nora, I think, to talk to us, give us a bit more of a global perspective on your Ipcc, but also on CCUS, given that you're from the CCSA.
I'll just unmute. Thank you so much, Ruth, for that introduction. Wasn't expecting all of that, but thank you. So I'm going to talk today about the just global progress on CCS. The agenda will be just taking us through global scientific consensus on CCS, mainly on the latest Ipcc report, and then we'll talk a little bit about CCS in international policy and trends, and then we'll have a look at the global status of CCS, predominantly from our own database at the Institute. So to start, CCS is vital for net zero. It achieves deep decarbonization in hard to abate sectors, enables production of low carbon hydrogen at scale, provides low carbon dispatchable power, and delivers negative emissions. I think after the great presentations from David and Ruth, we're all sort of already locked into that. So global scientific consensus on CCS. So the key takeaways from the Ipcc Working Group 3 report. And just to clarify, the Working Group 3 report came out in April, and it is the most relevant report, and it really sets the tone, and it sets the mitigation pathways available for countries. So the main takeaways are, and this is actually detailed even further in a briefing that we published back in April from the Institute. But I'll just read through what was found. So CCS is an option to reduce emissions from large-scale fossil-based energy and industry sources, provided geological storage is available. We're not surprised by this statement as well, since we had the Ipcc 1.5 report that came out in 2018, which already included CCS in all the mitigation scenarios. Also to note that CCS features in almost all the mitigation scenarios, also in this case, except for one that had behavioral change, an excessive amount of behavioral change. So the next would be that the technical geological CO2 storage capacity exceeds the CO2 storage requirements through 2100 to limit global warming to 1.5, although regional availability could be a limiting factor. I'll show you everyone a map that we have of the geological storage capacity worldwide later in this presentation. And then compared to the oil and gas sector, it was found that CCS is less mature in the power sector, as well as cement and chemical production, where it is a critical mitigation option. Then I will also just talk a bit more about the policy side of things. So current global rates of CCS deployment are far below those in modeled pathways to limit global warming. Policy instruments, greater public support, and technological innovations could reduce these barriers. And then, of course, CO2 CCS is very important when it comes to technological carbon dioxide removal, seen in DAX and BECCS. And it was also found in the report that CCS may kickstart the hydrogen economy, so through blue hydrogen. Also, just to kind of visualize everything, and this kind of reflects some of the graphs that David showed. This is the IEA's interpretation of kind of mitigation pathways, and you'll see that they've given about 15% of abatement to CCS. So that's just a visualization. And then just to talk about the policy trends that we've been seeing worldwide. So CCS policy and project activity remains high in many parts of the world, but of course in Europe and North America, this predominates. But we're seeing many governments and businesses increasingly continuing to advance CCS projects and policy with new entrants. For example, we've seen in Russia and then in Malaysia and Indonesia. Also, more recently in the Middle East. The interest in the role of voluntary carbon markets for CCS is growing. So we touched a little bit on COP27 in Glasgow, and I was just in Bonn last month And we saw pretty, I would say, significant progress in terms of the intersessional work that we have kind of laid out for us before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So there'll be a lot of technical work when it comes to Article 6. So we're hoping to see more progress in that area. But of course, we also have the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which is a private sector led initiative. And we've seen the booming of the voluntary carbon market, especially last year. In terms of national carbon dioxide policy archetypes, we're finding a dichotomy between incentive and penalty-based regulatory systems, where we're finding that perhaps incentives-based work is best for CCS, but that of course could change. What we're hearing a lot about is sort of carbon storage units and carbon take-back obligations, which have been discussed thoroughly in academic circles through the University of Oxford and elsewhere in Edinburgh as well. But that's still kind of in the works. And then we have party-driven NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which are basically country plans that are given, set out under the Paris Agreement that are increasingly including CCS, and we'll have a list of those coming up soon. And then we've already touched upon this, but the Ukrainian crisis, we're not sure how this will impact CCS due to the increased emphasis on energy security and aspirations for net zero. So we'll see how those two come together. And just to look at the NDCs, so countries have, some countries that have CCS facilities in the pipeline don't have it in their NDCs. So this is, for example, in Malaysia and New Zealand. And this is just to say this is 2020, this is since 2021. So we'll be expecting updated NDCs this year. Maybe and hopefully we'll probably include more CCS. And then other countries that have CCS actually don't include, that have CCS in their NDCs don't have commercial CCS facilities. And that's true for Egypt and Kuwait. And then with the long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, these are more, they look further into 2080 sort of territory. So 80% of them include CCS in their reports.
Right, just to let you know, it's quite hard to hear you now. There's quite a lot of background noise. I don't know if you can do anything about that, but just to let you know.
I'm so sorry. I'm actually in a co-working space.
Trials of
should I move?
working. That's okay. Maybe just move your microphone a bit closer to your mouth.
Okay. Yeah, it just suddenly became really loud. But sorry, everyone. Let me know if that's okay, and I can continue. Otherwise, I can go and find somewhere else.
I think just continue for now, and then maybe you can move for the questions.
So, yes. So just the global status of CCS, so these are updated numbers. And as you see, there was of course a dip, which was due to the global financial crisis most likely. And then after the Paris Agreement in 2015, we saw a steady rise in CCS projects. And you'll notice in 2022, we've had a very significant jump, and also just to direct your attention to a significant amount of announced projects. And then here are the suitable storage regions of the world based on global our storage basin assessment database. So you can see the highly suitable areas, suitable, possible, and unlikely areas, and you can find pockets sort of in the West, East, Europe, Southeast Asia, towards Australia that are highly suitable. And then just interestingly, we can cross-check what that's looking in terms of CCS facilities that are in construction and commercial. So we have most CCS facilities are found in the US at the moment, followed by the UK, the Netherlands, and Belgium. But we're seeing much more work scattered around worldwide increasingly. So what are the drivers of the CCS momentum? We found that the rise of CCS networks is contributing to this. Net zero commitments from countries and companies, the emergence of strategic business partnerships that are happening or increasing CCS. So, for example, sort of an oil refinery, is partnering with a financial institution or a shipping company. These are really driving CCS momentum. blue hydrogen projects are also driving this momentum, and technology-based carbon neutral are also key drivers. So on CCS networks, they're taking off globally. So they, we've already talked a little bit about that today, but there are multiple industrial point sources. And what they do is they really give, access to large geological storage resources for companies that are not necessarily large scale companies. So they've given access to CCS at a lower cost, and they reduce risk, and they really support the commercial viability of CCS. So we also have, this is from our global status report, which is produced annually. And you'll see from numbers 9 to 14, these are the UK clusters and hubs, which were actually mentioned in Ruth's presentation. And you'll notice the UK-based hubs networks are predominantly, they focus a lot on hydrogen production, and they are also deep saline formation. So a lot of technical information can be found through this, and then you can also see worldwide what's happening in terms of the networks. Sorry, I'm getting confused now. So towards achieving a global climate target, so to achieve net zero emissions, CCS capacity must increase by 100-fold by 2050. And this translates to basically being 40 million tons today to multiple gigatons by mid-century. So to achieve that stronger policy, strong action by 2030 is crucial. This is especially given that it takes around 10 years from conception to operation for a CCS project. So really starting now to really put that investment in is really vital over the next decade. And so the policy priorities would be creating conditions for investment, facilitating development of CO2 infrastructure. I think this really goes well with what you're saying, clarifying key legal and regulatory issues and unlocking CCS and carbon markets. And we're actually doing that through the advisory group for the CCS Plus initiative, which is looking at methodologies for Article 6 and voluntary carbon market. And the COP27 outlook. So just to circle back to the Paris Agreement and COP. So what's going to happen in Sharm el-Sheikh is we're going to have a continuation of the global stocktake. And it's really an opportunity for conversations between countries and technical experts. So we're going to be looking forward to hearing more on CCS through those kinds of platforms. And then Article 6, which we'll see a lot of technical intercessional work, and the supervisory body, which will be sort of in charge of 6.4, the mechanism and how the methodologies will work and all of those processes will happen, is scheduled to have its first meeting in July after the recent nominations of the members. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone could hear me through all the noise.
Thanks, Nora. I mean, thankfully your sides are really clearly set out, so what we didn't hear we could read, so thank you very much for that. There's some really good questions on the international stuff, so I'd like to kind of dive into that first and then maybe come back to some of the earlier questions around the UK. There's a couple of questions here about sort of how we're monitoring, that between ambition and reality. In particular, there's one from Tom Ruska about what level of certainty do we have on total emissions, both CO2 and methane? How is that verified? And I guess we're fortunate to have the CCC in the UK, but also, do we have an accurate picture of that globally? David, do you want to kick off on that one?
Sure. So I mean, for CO2, it's more well established, and we have more confidence in the process, I think, than for some of the other emissions, because ultimately, in most cases, CO2 emissions result from consumption of fossil fuels, and we're able to measure how much coal, oil, gas, etc. Is being consumed, and therefore infer how much CO2 is released. For methane, it's different, and in the absence of ubiquitous monitoring of methane concentrations, and particularly around point sources of methane, such as old coal mines, gas fields and so on, there is uncertainty about that. Actually, that monitoring is important, because if there is a big leak of methane, great if we know about it so we can do something about it. So I think it's important not only for the stats, but actually also for limiting the impact on warming. In agriculture, we know more about methane, but only because we kind of estimate a certain amount of methane per cow, and we know how many cows there are. So it's different methods, and there's different degrees of certainty on different things. With better monitoring, it would be great, as well as better estimation in other ways, better modelling. It'd be great to have more confidence in those numbers, but we've got pretty good confidence on most of the sources of emissions, I would say. Okay,
that's good. We didn't really touch on this globally, but there was another question about more to you, Nora, but I think it's relevant in terms of tracking progress globally of emissions, that of the 27 currently operational plants, people have noted that 20 were used for enhanced oil recovery, and it's important to distinguish between what's captured and permanently stored versus what's captured and subsequently used for other climate damaging activities. So, I mean, this is something we care very much about, the CCSA. We support permanent geological storage, and we, that's why we're exploring CCUS. So clearly around the world it's different, and previously things have been learned about CCS technologies through other activities that weren't driven by climate goals. But is there anything you wanted to say about that? And a further point someone has built on with that, saying, should CO2 EOR that develops new acidic gas fields, which are a source of CO2, be classed as CCUS?
So I can have a quick go at that, and then maybe Nora, you want to say something as well. I mean, it is complicated. We in the CCC again are not keen on enhanced oil recovery, but it is important to recognise that if the demand for oil is there, it is reasonable to assume that some oil will be produced somewhere in the world, and that therefore the oil produced with enhanced oil recovery is not necessarily additional to that. Nevertheless, it's not a great look if what you're trying to do is CCS for climate reasons. It's not a great look if actually you are enabling emitting in a different way. So if for no other reason, it's clearly not very sensible for the CCS industry to be pushing that in a big way. The other thing I'd say is that the relatively high proportion of CCS projects that have enhanced oil recovery, for me, is not so much a function of the enhanced oil recovery. It's the fact that globally we have not put in place frameworks that put a value on that CO2 for climate reasons, and therefore the projects that go ahead is where there's a value in another way, which is it's useful for oil production. I think if we can get proper policy frameworks that put a value on that CO2 for climate reasons, then we'd see a lot more projects that are not enhanced oil recovery, and those would dwarf the enhanced oil recovery projects that we're seeing.
Okay, can I build on that and then ask Nora to come in? So Nora, there's another question about whether any countries have equivalent to the UK's CIF fund for CCUS project development. So again, are there incentives that will encourage people to do something other than EOR? And also your views on EOR, please.
Thank you. I actually think I resolved my the microphone issue, because somebody really kindly in the chat said you have to hook it up with the mic. So sorry about that, everyone. First, I just want to say about the question on EOR before. We are just getting really very much involved now with climate justice, and we are increasingly starting conversations, and we really want to learn more and contribute more in that conversation. So I want to thank them for that question, and just say we are working on that, and to kind of give a deeper dive on that. In terms of the question on whether there is someone else doing that, we have the EU Innovation Fund that also has similar kind of policies that also strengthen the CCS landscape. So I hope and that's what I'm aware of so far.
Yes, and actually our Brussels office have many much more information about that. So people can also go to the Zero Emissions Platform website and find out about all of the EU's funding there. There were a couple of couple of questions about the security of CO2. What actions would need to be done in existing wells where we are disposing the CO2? And then there was also a question about, yeah, I think we'd answer that one first. So obviously where CO2 is being disposed, what's really, really important is that there's metering of the CO2 that goes to the store. So we know how much has been sent to the site, that CO2 is injected at pressures, and it's kind of like a reverse process, essentially. It's a reversal of the extraction process, and the well is depressurized, and therefore the CO2 is sucked in, and it's sucked into the well. If it's an aquifer, it's a slightly, you know, it's a variation on that process, but essentially the CO2 goes into the geological formations. And prior to any of that happening, the geological formations have to go through several years of appraisal process. So in the UK, there's a very strict regulatory regime run by the North Sea Transition Authority, which requires sites to be fully appraised before they can be developed and given a storage permit. So you first get a license, and the license allows you to appraise the store. After you've done lots and lots of appraisals, so drilling or checking your existing wells if they're already wells that can be reused, and modelling what's going to happen with the CO2, putting in small amounts of CO2 to see what happens. That goes on for quite some time before you can build a picture and be confident that that CO2 will stay there on geological timescales. So there's quite a lot of work that goes into preparing these sites for CO2, that it's not just a kind of, oh, right, well, yesterday we finished extraction, tomorrow we're going to inject CO2. They have to be made suitable, and the infrastructure has to be made suitable. So, yeah, and it's very important, obviously, that there is monitoring and verification of the CO2 plume and where it's going, similar to what we've had with the Sleipner site in Norway, and that data's all been in the public domain, and I think that's a really, really important point as well. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that one. No, so there's another really good, a couple of good questions as well about the UK situation, the political situation. So some of those aimed at me and what the CCSA thinks. I think I would just be clear, the CCSA is really, really pleased to see the Energy Security Bill laid in Parliament yesterday. It's going to go through the House of Lords this month, and I think that is really encouraging for the industry, because there are many detailed provisions in there to lay the regulatory framework for the industry, and I think that's really, really important for both the transport and storage infrastructure and for the powers to award the revenue support contracts. There's also been another question here about whether the 1 billion CIF is ring-fenced and safe from future comprehensive spending reviews and from changes of government. Again, I don't think any money is ever safe from any change of government, but I think it's fair to say that if the government has laid a bill and are going to the trouble of all the resources to do that, and as I know they have developed very detailed and investable business models, to then not use those would be kind of quite a waste of public money as well, I would suggest. So I think it feels like the momentum is here. All the messaging we're receiving from those ministers that are still in post is that they are determined to carry on and do this. But clearly, it's never been more important, I suppose, to keep communicating about how important this is for the climate and how time is running out. As David said, we've had a couple of failed attempts to get CCUS going, and if we had built CCUS on coal-fired power station back in whenever it was 2008-9, I suppose we might have had 1 or 2 CCS plants working by now, and we'd be further down this track. So yeah, we all want to get started. David, did you have anything to say about the sort of political uncertainty and I suppose the challenge for wider net zero from that?
I don't want to say too much about the political situation, particularly as I've been off Twitter for a couple of hours, and who knows what the situation is now. But no, I mean, there is a very broad consensus on climate action in the UK. We're fortunate to have that and recognise that isn't the case in every country that's trying to act on climate change. So, Parliament seems very broadly to be keen on net zero, and therefore, fingers crossed, the current events will not affect ambition too much.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, another one of these questions really just highlights how critical it is that we get going. CCS may feature in many mitigation scenarios, but there's a huge deployment gap of 34 million tonnes of CO2 a year versus 1,200 million tonnes of CO2 a year by 2030. And this is according to the IEA. Featuring in a mitigation scenario is not the same as contributing to it. How can we sort of get the $650 billion to $1.3 trillion of investment needed to build 70 to 100 plants a year that the GCCSI says needs to be unlocked? What are the mechanisms for that, Nora? How do you see that happening?
Well, I'll first answer a little bit on the first question about the UK. So I think it's also very interesting just to talk about how there's $1 billion plus in funding in the UK and 4 CCS clusters between now and 2030. So I think just to say that that's really, really promising. And then we definitely need regulatory mechanisms, and transport and storage needs to be scaled up.
Yes, thanks, Nora. I think some of what you were talking about in terms of the Ipcc process and Article 6, some of that's going to take a long time, but presumably the trading, the emissions trading systems around the world and bilateral agreements between countries as well could drive the deployment of CCUS. However, I think, at CCSA, our view is that we need to encourage countries to move forward nationally and not wait for those things. Also, there's the voluntary carbon market. I don't know what your view is about whether that can really drive action more quickly and what the challenges are there.
Yeah, so that's why it's really important to remember that we have the global stocktake that's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27 this year. So that will really, the global stocktake informs the nationally determined contributions that the countries will publish in the upcoming years. So that's why we're really focusing on including CCS in that conversation up until 2023, and then hopefully that will kind of increase the presence of CCS in these determined contributions. And then on markets, yes, obviously Article 6 is slower than sort of what we have available right now, but I think also it's important to know that we do have a voluntary carbon market that's active and functioning right now. And through the CCS Plus initiative, we are just in the process of creating the right methodologies for CCS and different ways to use CCS so that we can kind of access that funding available through carbon markets, especially when you look at concepts like additionality. I think it's key to ensuring that projects kind of just get started.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Nora. That's a really good summary of where we are internationally. David, anything to add, final closing remarks before I wrap this up?
Just a couple of things on what was just discussed. I mean, there is a lot of greenwashing around net zero in the corporate world at the moment. There's a lot of companies declaring, 2030 or 2025 net zero targets, and there's a big emphasis on the net there that's not really, it's not really okay in terms of what we really mean by net zero in the climate world. So that needs to change, and we'll be publishing something later in the year on companies and offsetting and compatibility with net zero. And the other thing is around emissions trading, and as the UK and the EU align their caps with the path for net zero, I would expect the incentives for CCS to be significantly strengthened in those markets. And of course, that's not the only thing you need. You do need the infrastructure, you need the investable contracts, but I think that's a big step forward.
Yeah, thank you, David. I would agree. I think it just, I would agree that we need to stay positive and focused on the task ahead, recognizing the huge risks of if we should fail, and the need to constantly check progress and flag concerns and resolve them and work together to do that. So I'm really grateful to you both for your time and your excellent presentations. Thanks to all the participants, really good quality Q&A that's given us a really good discussion. So thank you very much. And I hope that this session has helped people to understand a bit more about net zero, CCUS's role in that, and some of the challenges and opportunities there. All the slides and recordings will be available to you all afterwards, and also on the CCSA website. And keep an eye out on our social media and website for further information on upcoming webinars. So thanks again to both of our speakers and to the participants online. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Thanks very much.